If you like this kind of content, please consider supporting me on Patreon, where you'll get early access to my tutorials as well as the unedited full-length videos. Hey guys, welcome back to the 7th part of the Obi-Wan Kenobi tutorial series. In this video, I'm going to walk you through my process of creating a realistic skin shader inside of Maya Arnold. So, jumping back into Maya here from where we left off in the 5th video, as you can see, I've got my displacement and bump maps set up, as well as the Albedo map from the 3DS wrap. The first thing that I'll do is to make a selection around the head so that I'm not rendering the full image. Going to the hypershade, I'm going to view my Arnold standard shader that's applied to the head and unhook the diffuse map for now. In the shader, I'm going to go to presets and replace the current shader with the skin preset. So as you can see, it's switched off the diffuse weight. It's left the spec weight to 1, but for now I'm just going to switch that off. It's set the subsurface weight to 1 and also the coat weight to 0.25, which again I'm just going to switch off for now to concentrate just on the subsurface part of the shader. In the subsurface color parameter, I'm going to change the generic pink color to a neutral 0.18 gray. This just allows me to see the scattering effect a little bit more clearly. I'm also going to switch the type to Random Walk version 2. I always feel like this is a little bit more accurate and also preserves the details a little bit better. Now that that's set up, I'm just going to do a quick test render to see what these values give me. I can see that the scattering is working, but the render is a little bit noisy. So I'm going to bump up the subsurface samples in the render settings. As you can see, the light is scattering a little bit too much. The render is looking a little bit waxy right now, especially around the ears and the nose. One thing to mention is that it's important that your model is to the real world scale. The height of my model from the chin to the top of the head is about 25 centimeters, which is accurate to a life-size male head. The two parameters that affect the amount of scattering happening are scale and radius. The radius is the color that's being scattered inside the model. If I look at the values of R, G, and B, I can see that by default, red is set to 1, green is set to 0.3, and blue is set to 0.1. The way that I've interpreted these values by doing some of my own render experiments is that a value of 1 causes the light to scatter 10 centimeters in depth. So we can say that red light will scatter 10 centimeters in depth, green light will scatter 3 centimeters in depth, and blue light will scatter 1 centimeter in depth. I believe that the ratio of 1 to 0.3 to 0.1 is somewhat accurate to how the different wavelengths will scatter inside the skin. But I don't think that the depth is correct for human skin. So the way that I fix this is by using a scale parameter. By default, it's set to 1. The radius values are going to be multiplied by the scale value. So at the moment, red light with a depth of 10 centimeters will be multiplied by 1. So 10 times 1 equals 10 centimeters, so no change there. I've researched a little bit online and found that light scatters about 1.2 to 1.3 centimeters into the skin. So by changing the scale to 0.13, I'm multiplying that 10 centimeters in the red channel by 0.13, which gives me a value of 1.3 or 1.3 centimeters. So let's give this another test render. The scatter is looking a lot more realistic now. The ears and the nose are not looking so waxy anymore, and the skin is holding the details fairly well. One thing that I like to do is to reduce the red channel by about 5 to 10% and increase the green channel by about 5%. The change is going to be very subtle, but I feel like it helps a little bit. So at the moment, my scatter depth is all one value. The light is being scattered on the cheeks and the nose and the ears at all the same rate, which is not very realistic. So what I'm going to do now is to plug in my SSS scale map that I created in Mari in the last video. I'll import the map and make sure I change the color space to utility raw. I'll turn off any filtering and also make sure that this shader is connected to the R channel instead of the alpha. The map's base value is 0.13, just like our default value, but I also painted in some higher and lower values for the different areas of the skin, as well as adding the displacement green channel to add some detail to the map. Doing a test render, I can see that I'm getting a little bit more scattering effect happening, which means that my map's average value is probably higher than 0.13. This is probably due to the displacement G channel layer that I've added, which is raising the values a little bit. An easy way to correct this is to just lower the exposure of the map. This will keep all the detail of the map, but just lower the values. It's looking better, but maybe I need to go a little bit further with this. This is looking better now. What I like is that the scatter is closer to the original render, but in areas like the ears and the cheeks and the lips, it has slightly more scattering effect. So now that I have the scatter radius sorted, I'm ready to add my albedo map from Mari. I'll import the file and change the color space to ACES CG, as I exported it out of Mari as ACES CG. I'll also turn off the filtering and give it a test render. Looking at my reference image, the skin is looking a little bit on the pink side in the render. It's difficult to determine this, as the reference is in a different lighting condition under a different color space, and also the specular on the reference skin will be washing out the color somewhat, but I still think the reds are looking a little bit too saturated. So what I'm going to do is to create an AI color correct node and plug it into the shader as well as the color map. In the multiply parameter, I'm going to reduce the red channel by about 6% and then do another test render. I can see that the midtones of the skin are now matching a little bit closer to the midtones of the reference. And like I said, once we add the specular on top of the render, it will wash out some of those tones in the highlights. The difference between the current render and the previous render is quite a lot. Just by reducing the red slightly is making our render look a little bit more natural. So next, I'm going to add the specular lobe back into our shader by setting the weight back to 1. I'm also going to add coat and specular to the AOV list to get a better understanding of what's happening. And then I'll do a test render of these default values. Already I can see just how much the specular changes the values of the skin tone and also the look of the overall render. Going into the specular AOV, I can see the exact values that it's adding. Like I said in the last video, I like to create 2 specular lobes for my skin shaders. One is the specular of the skin itself, and the second is a coating of specular that represents water or oils on the surface of the skin. I keep the specular weight to 1 because I want 100% of the skin's surface area to have specular. I keep the spec color to 1 as most dielectric materials, including skin, have a spec color close to 1. But I will change the specular IOR. This controls how forward facing the reflection is. 1.33 is the IOR of water, which isn't a bad starting point for skin. But when I think about all the different molecules inside of a skin cell other than water, it makes more sense to me to raise this value up slightly. So I usually go with about 1.45. I'm also going to decrease the roughness for now until I plug in my roughness map, and I'll just do a new test render. As you can see, bringing up the IOR has really changed how forward facing the reflection is. There's a lot of specular reflection on that jawline, but I know that this is something that I've painted rougher in my roughness map, so I'm going to plug this in and see if there's any change. Once I've imported the map, I'll set its color space to utility raw and turn off any filtering and make sure that the shader is plugged into the output R channel of the map. I'll do a test render and see how this is looking. The spec is looking a lot rougher now, which means that the average value of my map is probably higher than 0.42. This could be caused from adding the displacement layer into the map, just like the scale map. I'm still getting some nice specular, but I feel like I've lost too much. So I'm going to go into my map's color balance settings and just start lowering the exposure down to make my map less rough. This is looking a lot better now, but maybe it's still too much on the cheeks. It's hard to tell in this lighting environment, as there's a strong light source just behind the character's screen right shoulder. I'm going to bring back the exposure slightly and then re-render. I think this is looking better now. What I'm looking for when I'm doing this is a spec response that's not too rough, but not too glossy either. It's a bit of a subjective thing when you don't have a proper reference, but over time you get an idea of what looks correct. Now that I have my first specular lobe set up, I can start working on the second. I'll turn the coat weight back to 0.25 and I'll create another test render with these default values. I want the coat to be quite glossy as it represents a layer of water and oils on the surface of the skin. The glossiest part should be on the tip of the nose, the eyelids and the lips. I'm going to bump up the IOR slightly as it's currently set to the IOR of water, but I also want this to represent some of the skin oils. The side of the cheek is getting a little bit hot again, but it's hard to tell if this is just the HDRI causing this. I think I'm also ready to plug in my coat weight map to break up this second layer of specular. I'll import the file and set the color space to utility raw. I'll also turn off the filtering and do another test render. It's looking very glossy at the moment, but I did forget to plug in the R channel of my map, so right now it's set to the alpha, which is 1. That's looking a bit better now. I'm getting a really nice fall off between the two specular lobes, and also some variation. I feel like the coat might be slightly too rough, so I'm going to bring down the roughness parameter. I think that the lower you can bring this roughness parameter without the render looking too glossy, the more realistic it will look. I'm also going to create an AI color correct node and plug it into the R channel of my coat weight map. In there, I want to up the contrast a little bit to get a little bit more variation in the map. I think it's looking better, but it can still most likely benefit from a little bit less roughness. Even though it's looking a little bit too specular on the cheeks and the jaw, I feel like a lot of that is to do with the HDRI. Going into my AOVs, I can see that the coat response is a lot tighter than my spec response, which is exactly what I want. Looking at my reference, the skin is not looking too bad in terms of both the colour and the specularity, even though there's a difference in the lighting conditions. Under the eyes and the tip of the nose have a tighter spec, which is adding to the realism. And also I'm seeing a lot of specular detail on the forehead, which is looking really nice. The only thing left to do now is to test this shader in different lighting environments at higher resolutions. So I'm going to come into my render settings and set it to 3K, as well as bumping up the camera AA samples. So my test renders are finished, and I'm seeing a lot more details now. Even the hot speck on the cheeks has resolved a little bit better. I think the shader is holding up quite nicely in the different lighting environments, and nothing is jumping out at me that needs to be fixed. In an overcast, more diffuse environment, the coat is a little bit subdued, but it's still looking quite natural and realistic. And that's it for this video. In the next part, I'm going to go over how I create the eyeballs, the texturing of the eyeballs, and the eye shader. I hope to see you all there. Cheers guys.